the atheists gone? The answer may surprise you. Let's talk about it with Justin Brierley on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Hey, we are so glad you're here. We recognize in the busy schedule that you have to give up an hour for us is a major gift to you. And if you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter, our executive producer, is here. And in all seriousness, Matthew has been touched by greatness. It happened this morning when I gave him a high five. Our producer, Jinx, is in the little glass booth. Jinx was excited to hear they discovered water on Mars. He figures that means there might also be fishing on Mars. And our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in his tech bunker. John says that all the world's a program, and all the men and women merely users. That's from the Shakespeare play, As You Like It. That would be As You Like IT. Somebody had to explain that to me.
Here's why that's funny.
Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. George says dead atheists should technically be referred to as former atheists. And Kathy Wyatt is the soft, feminine side of the program. Kathy, it's mid-September. Too early to try out Christmas cookie recipes?
No, I've already started.
Good. Well, you're going to test them on us.
I am going to do that. Yes, indeed.
Hey, y'all, this is going to be a great program. Despite the fact that the guest talks funny, he says great things. Our guest is Justin Brierley. And we hear so much bad news that sometimes it just gets depressing. But we're going to hear some good news during this broadcast. Justin is a UK broadcaster, writer, and speaker. He also hosts the podcast Unbelievable and Ask NT Wright Anything. We did that on a program here with Dr. Wright, and it was a wonderful hour. Justin's new book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. They had to make the book bigger to get the whole title on the cover. Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
It's a delight to be with you, Steve, and the team. And I've worked in radio a lot myself, and I can tell that you guys are a fun family team, just from the banter that's already been going on here.
Well, you're fortunate to be a part of it.
I am. I consider myself blessed.
We know what in the world is New Atheism?
Well, New Atheism was really old atheism, but dressed up in new clothes, because it was essentially the same thing, the non-belief in God, but it had a kind of media sheen this time, and it was being fronted by people who knew how to give a soundbite, people who were becoming internet celebrities at the time. It was a sort of publishing boom as well, and it was really led by what's sometimes called the four horsemen of New Atheism. The scientist Richard Dawkins, he had a best-selling book called The God Delusion back in the mid-2000s. Sam Harris also had his own best-selling anti-God book. Christopher Hitchens, one of my fellow countrymen, a wonderful journalist, raconteur, but also very anti-religious, and he had a book called Why Religion Poisons Everything. And And Daniel Dennett made up the fourth horseman of this new atheism. He was a sort of philosopher. And it was just a movement, yeah, around the mid 2000s, arguably on the heels of 9/11 and a sense of religion, is bad for us kind of vibe that really caught on. And I think it was the fact that it came with the coming of age of the internet, social media, and so on. It really caught a lot of people's imagination, fired a lot of people up, led to things like in my country, the atheist bus campaign. This was red London buses circulating the capital, bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And so it was a very much an in your, yeah, it was literally
Probably.
that though. And yeah, that's it. They kind of didn't go all the way to "There's definitely no God." They kind of left it kind of open-ended. And personally, I thought it was a wonderful campaign because most people in the UK weren't bothered whether there was a God or not. So to have atheists kind of telling them there's probably no God was actually a great conversation starter in a funny way. So in the end, it was a very in-your-face form of denial of belief. It got a lot of column inches, it got a lot of attention. But in the end, yeah, it sort of had a shelf life, I suppose. I would say of about 10 to 15 years roughly. But it was an interesting new instantiation of atheism in the mid 2000s.
I'll probably never write a book called "Why There's No Santa Claus." If I felt that way, I mean, I don't understand. They need to get a life. I read one of the books and I thought, I can't believe he said that. That's so shallow. I don't think they read a book ever or did any research. They just spit it out. And I am kind of pleased that there's an attack of sanity going on and people are beginning to realize that. Tell us about the Unbelievable podcast.
Well, I've hosted conversations between Christians and atheists for nearly over a decade and a half. And so I began the Unbelievable show here in the UK on radio and then on podcast and video back in it would have been 2005 that I began the show. And this was very much in the heyday of New Atheism.
Yeah.
A lot of that kind of talk going on in the public square. So it was a show that very much traded on those kind of combative dialogues and debates that were the kind of stuff that was going on. People like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, opposite Christian thinkers like William Lane Craig, Alistair McGrath, and others. And so I really enjoyed being at the center of those kinds of dialogues and debates. It was quite invigorating. And I hosted the show for over 17 years. I only moved on from hosting it just last year, actually. And it was a wonderful education for me in actually how much common sense and intellectual strength there is actually in Christianity. Because what I discovered in the process of hosting hundreds of these conversations between atheists and Christians was that actually atheism has to answer some questions as well. It's important that Christians be able to stand up and answer questions about their faith. But actually, naturalism, atheism is itself a worldview. And it's actually a worldview that has all kinds of issues going on. I think there are lots of aspects of atheism that are really hard to reconcile with the universe we find ourselves in and the nature of human life. So I discovered in the end, it wasn't just about Christians defending what they believed against these atheists. It was about asking atheists some hard questions too. And I discovered in the process that actually Christianity is a really compelling worldview, and that while there are important questions and mysteries along the way, actually it made sense. So I ended up writing a book. My first book was sort of really a kind of look at the whole issue of faith and why I think Christianity makes better sense than atheism. And eventually it led to the conversations themselves changing, because I noticed that New Atheism itself was starting to wane, because by the time I finished hosting that show last year, the landscape had really changed. The New Atheism, to some extent, was something of a bygone thing by that point. And the kinds of conversations I was hosting had changed quite dramatically from those early years.
Did you, while you were doing it, did you sense a change in the air with people who were involved in the podcast, or you just looked up and all of a sudden the New Atheists were dying?
Well, I think the first hints of it came kind of early on, actually, because actually New Atheism wasn't popular with every atheist out there because it was very dogmatic, quite bombastic.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't very deep, as you say. A lot of those books were actually quite shallow in their treatment of faith and religion. A lot of academic atheists were actually somewhat appalled and embarrassed by the movement because it was so slogan driven and so dismissive of religion. And so, from the outset, actually, there were atheists who were saying, look, this movement doesn't really represent me. And increasingly, as I went on in the show, I discovered more and more atheists who, when they came on, sort of were distancing themselves from Richard Dawkins and his fellow horsemen, saying, I'm not a Richard Dawkins sort of atheist. But I think what accompanied that, and I sort of watched this with interest from the sidelines, was that the atheist movement itself, the New Atheist movement, really started to unravel in all kinds of interesting ways in the years that I was hosting the show. And this took the form of various controversies that Richard Dawkins got involved with. There was a famous episode called Elevator Gate, which was kind of the culture wars coming early for New Atheism when
Justin,
listen. Yes, please.
This is so good. And we got to go to a commercial break. If there were a God, we wouldn't have to do this. But we're going to continue that sentence on the other side of the break. The book is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. You don't want to miss a second of this broadcast. We're going to rest up. Then, like Jesus, we're coming back. Hey, thanks for joining us. We're talking to Justin Brierley. Justin's new book is called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and that would be enough. But there's a subtitle, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. Before we get back to the conversation, Justin, you've started a new podcast, haven't you? What is it?
I have. Yeah. It's also called, unsurprisingly, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Really, it's actually a documentary podcast series. So it's very much told in a storytelling narrative way with lots of different talking heads, lots of different contributors. And what I've done is I've taken each chapter of this book and I've kind of divided those chapters into episodes. And so we really do a deep dive onto the way that New Atheism kind of fell apart. We do a lot of kind of conversation and detail on some of these new secular thinkers who are talking about God again in the public sphere. And we talk a lot about some of the surprising conversions, adult converts to Christian faith, some very surprising stories along the way. So it's been really fun. It's been a bit different to what I've done before, which is more kind of the long form conversation. It's been fun to kind of sit down and put together this long form documentary series instead.
Now, we'll give some contact information later on, so you ought to have a pen and a piece of paper close by. People in the States can pick up this podcast, can't they?
Absolutely, yeah. It's available wherever you are in the world. Just look for, wherever you get your podcast from, just look for The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God.
Okay. Now, before the break, you were about to give us some dirt, and we're always open to that sort of thing. You were talking about how the New Atheism died or was dying, and then you were giving us some specifics when I interrupted you. Would you?
Well, there's a really interesting story. Not many people know it, about the way that this New Atheist movement began to unravel in all kinds of interesting ways. And in the book and the podcast series, I sort of pinpoint a specific atheist conference in 2011 where I think it just started to come apart. And this was happening in Dublin, in Ireland. And Richard Dawkins, well-known New Atheist, was one of the speakers at this conference. And one of the other speakers was a young female atheist vlogger called Rebecca Watson, who went under the title Skepchick online. And she was there talking about the fact that she was witnessing a lot of misogyny, sexism, patriarchy in the New Atheist movement. And she was complaining about the fact it was dominated by, well, people like you, Steve, old white men, basically. and it was kind of, but not just that, it was that there was genuinely a lot of awful behavior she found in the comments, you know, on her YouTube videos from atheist guys. And so she kind of delivered a whole seminar on this. Now, that evening, after having drinks till the early hours with some of the other conference speakers at the hotel, she went to go back to her room. And as she was getting into the elevator, another conference attendee got in with her and basically propositioned her, said, "Would you like to come back to my room for coffee?" And she said, and she kind of talked about this afterwards on her channel and said, "This is the problem, guys. I've literally just done this atheist seminar on what the problem with misogyny in the atheist community, and then I get propositioned in an elevator." Now that might have been the end of the story, except that someone who weighed in on this on the blog was Richard Dawkins himself, and he in response he wrote a highly sarcastic blog post titled "Dear Muslima," in which he condescendingly kind of compared her trials with a Muslim woman in another country suffering terrible things, but saying, "Oh, don't worry about having your hands chopped off, Muslima. Think of our poor American sisters being asked back to someone's room for coffee." and so it was very, very kind of, it was dripping in sarcasm, you know. Anyway, this just set off a hand grenade in the atheist community, because there were people who were on this woman's side and saying, this is the problem. We've got all these white men, patriarchy, misogyny, and people who are on Richard Dawkins' side essentially saying, we just need common sense. Let's not get into all this political correctness. So this, as I say, it was kind of like the Me Too movement came early for the New Atheist community. And from that moment on, I can honestly say from that moment on, suddenly all kinds of issues started to flare up, and you started to get basically this division within the community between those who wanted to go in a very kind of social justice oriented direction on issues like feminism, LGBT, and so on, and others who just said, no, this is just political correctness. We want our oasis of free thinking. And so what I noticed was increasingly this community started to fracture, unravel, to the point where these atheist leaders were no longer willing to share a stage. There were atheist conferences being cancelled because people had fallen out so dramatically. And even Richard Dawkins, interestingly, you know, he kind of had a taste of this himself. Just in 2021, he had his Humanist of the Year award rescinded by the American Humanist Association. And the reason for that was because of his kind of stance on transgender. As a biologist, he had started to critique the transgender movement, but that was a kind of no-go area as far as some atheists were concerned. So you see all of these interesting fallouts, and what it left behind was really a kind of very diluted, split, a kind of a movement that had kind of unraveled internally. And so that's part of the story I tell in the book and the podcast.
That is so good.
How fascinating is it that atheists have their own denominations? Yeah. No, I'm not that kind of. I'm this kind of. I'm reformed atheist. You guys are so lost.
It did sound a little like the church.
Yeah. You're like, I'm not that kind. Anyhow,
Well, the funny thing is, I mean, just to come back on that in a serious way, I honestly think, and one of the points I make in the book and the podcast is that we're all actually quite religious deep down. And even people who call themselves atheists, they're kind of acting out another form of religion, if I'm honest. It's just that in the New Atheism, their kind of holy scriptures were these books by these best-selling authors, and their high priests were the Four Horsemen, and their creed was like a naturalist philosophy of life. And they had their heretics and their outgroups as well. So I just think that the religious instinct goes very deep. It can just be channeled in some very misguided directions. And I just think New Atheism was kind of another manifestation of that in many ways.
Well, you know, we had the God is Dead movement in this country. Time magazine, this has been 100 years ago, probably before you were born. And the interesting thing about that, it didn't last as long as your New Atheism did. The interesting thing about the God is Dead movement is how quickly it died. It died right away. And, we shouldn't be triumphalist about it and have our peacock feathers flying in the breeze. But it is kind of satisfying. You want to say, I told you so. You just didn't listen. we're about out of time in this segment, and we're going to take a break because this is hard work. You know, you don't know as an outsider how difficult and how hard this is to do. So it is important for your sake and for our sake that we take some time, have some milk and cookies, and rest up, and then come back. This is a great program. If you miss any of it, you're out of your mind. The book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, the author, Justin Brierley. This would be a great book to study in a small group, and then you can laugh and laugh and laugh at the atheist. Don't go away. We're hanging out with author and broadcaster Justin Brierley, and his book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, is so good I can hardly stand it. The subtitle, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. By the way, if you want to keep up with Justin, it's not creative, but it's easy to remember. JustinBrierley.com. And on X at JUS Brierley, JUSBRIERLEY.
All right. Justin, I have so many questions. This is a topic that we sometimes occasionally talk about, but very rarely are we talking to somebody who is in the trenches with this subject day in, day out for decades. So tons of questions. You know, when I think of atheism, it comes to mind a comedian who I like, but every single one of his specials, no matter what the topic is or what the subject is, he finds a way to do a bit about why belief in God is so stupid, and that it literally is that. It's just dismissive. And my takeaway is not taking offense. It's like you seem to be, this seems to be occupying your mind a whole lot. You're like,
Methinks thou dost protest.
Yes, it's very much like, I hate Sally. I hate her. Does she ever talk about me? Does she ever bring me up? And you're like, bro, you're Christ curious. Just embrace it, man. Patton Oswalt, I'm talking to you. So I was curious to know, in all of your conversations, are there any commonalities to what finally breaks through for an atheist to where they're like, I've got to let go of my death grip on this thing and realize there might be another answer? Or is it just all along the spectrum?
I mean, obviously, all atheists are different, and often atheists for different reasons. I mean, you mentioned sort of the comedian type atheist, and that was an interesting feature of New Atheism. There were a lot of comedians, you know, Ricky Gervais, Bill Maher, and so on, who kind of made a feature of kind of making fun of religion. I have noticed that's died off a bit in recent years, though, and I think that's partly because, kind of in common with what I was just describing, some of those folk now feel like they've got bigger fish to fry and things to battle, you know, on the kind of woke ideology front or whatever. That's what Bill Maher seems to have turned his attention to, and that's where the kind of the quasi-religious nature of that suddenly becomes apparent, and that's sort of, it's kind of replaced in many of these atheist minds. The problem is no longer Christianity, but it's on their own doorstep. It's in academia that they're realizing, oh, people have this religious mindset, if you like. So there's been an interesting shift in that way, and I've noticed even among many of my atheist acquaintances, they've started to kind of give Christianity a bit more of an open mind. They've realized that the religious instinct, as they say, kind of runs deep. I've got a good friend who runs an atheist channel called Alex O'Connor, and he very much was one of those new atheists when he started out. He was sort of modeling himself after Christopher Hitchens, but he's been through an interesting evolution where he's kind of realized, actually, you can't kind of stop people being intrinsically religious, and they're going to be religious about something. And I think he's realized that atheism can just become another kind of religious expression in that way. What makes the difference? I would say very frequently, it's not just an intellectual argument. Sometimes that's an important piece of the puzzle for someone. It might be that, you know, if they do have particular objections to Christianity, if you can give them a philosophical or intellectual explanation, that can help them. But I frequently find they won't listen necessarily to those intellectual arguments or be bothered by the questions really, until something has happened in their life that causes them to question their own worldview in general. And that's very often an emotional, relational, you know, spiritual kind of thing that happens. So one example I would point to is I received an email a little while ago from someone who'd come on my show as a very full-blooded atheist several years ago as a psychologist. And, you know, he had kind of done a good job defending his case opposite a Christian. It was years later that he then emailed me again and said, Justin, I'm really considering rejecting my atheism and becoming a Christian. And the reason was, he said that he'd had this huge relationship breakdown, and he realized that he just didn't have the resources on his atheistic worldview to deal with it. And suddenly the idea of faith suddenly seemed to become a possibility for him. And I've been seeing stories like that more and more. People who just kind of get to the point where they realize, this atheist worldview just isn't actually sustaining me anymore. It's not doing what I hoped it would do, or I was told it would do by the new atheists. And I just think it's often at that moment that someone opens themselves up to the possibility of changing their mind in the end.
And it seems like when that moment comes, the best thing that you could have done prior is not pummel them with stuff, but be a good friend and be loving and show God's love. And now that door is open if they want to go through it.
Exactly. And I would say, even if you've received a lot of grief from a new atheist type character, the important thing is not to give it back, in a sense, you know, to absolutely be that friend who is patient and gracious and all the things that, you know, 1 Peter 3:15 says we should do when we have questions from friends. Answer them with gentleness and respect. And I think when you play that long game, it's actually really good, because actually there's going to be a point at which that person does have genuine questions, when, you know, the life they're living isn't working out for them. And that's when they might realize, you know what, that person might just be the person I could actually ask about this and get some answers.
Oh, man. The book is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. If you've been depressed because you're a Christian and you think we're losing the battle, you got to get this book. You'll sleep better at night, I promise. Hey, thanks for spending time with us. By the way, have you tried the new free Key Life app yet? It's available on both iPhone and Android, and it's free. For more details, you can check it out at keylife.org/app.
Justin, you talk about some of what people might consider surprising conversions that you've seen. And people that you've talked to and observed and so forth. Can you talk about some of those?
Sure. I mean, this was one of the things that led me to writing the book and starting the podcast series, is that I was noticing just more and more interesting stories of adult conversions to Christian faith, people that you might not expect. And funnily enough, one of the most significant ones of the last year happened after I published the book. And that was the story of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Now, she was in many ways the most famous female atheist in the world, because her background is that she was born in Somalia. She was kind of raised in a very extremist Muslim sect, the Muslim Brotherhood, and she eventually fled Somalia to Europe to escape a forced marriage. And she very much rejected all forms of faith and God. She wrote a best-selling anti-God, anti-religion book, Infidel, and was very much part of the new atheist speaking circuit, sharing stages with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, all those guys. And you know, the last I'd heard up to recently was that she continued in that mold, until just November last year, And she published this viral article online titled "Why I Am Now a Christian." And what's fascinating about Ayaan Hirsi Ali's story is it's very much encapsulates the thesis of this book, because the reasons she gave for her conversion were that she found that atheism was too shallow a worldview in the end to sustain her life. She was feeling, she talks about her kind of intellectual conversion to the value of Christianity, that she realized that actually everything she holds dear in the West in terms of democratic values, freedom, dignity, and so on, really came from Christianity, not from atheism. And she also talks about the fact that she doesn't believe secular atheism can provide a sort of a bulwark against some of the big powers in the world, you know, Putin's Russia, China, fundamentalist Islam, what she sees as the dangers of woke ideology and so on. But more than that, she talked at a personal level in some subsequent interviews about her own journey and about the fact she'd become very depressed, suicidal, she'd become alcoholic, she'd gone through a number of therapists and counselors. And it was only when one of them asked her, "Have you considered praying?" that she said, "Well, I can't pray. I don't believe in God. The God I was raised with was a monster." And this counselor challenged her and said, "Well, what kind of God could you believe in?" And she began to describe the kind of God she might be willing to believe in. And she says, as I was describing that God, I realized I was describing Jesus Christ. And so she thought, well, I'm not going to go and invent a new God. Why don't we investigate this one, the first person who claimed to be God? And she started going to church. She started praying. And she says it's transformed her life. And that is just a remarkable turnaround, very surprising. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali is now being very forthright about her Christian faith. I think she's obviously still got a long way to go. You know, everyone's on a journey. But I just find it fascinating that as significant a figure as her has suddenly, just in the last year, had this complete turnaround. I mean, it's kind of the equivalent of Paul on the road to Damascus when it comes to atheist to Christian conversions. Yeah. So if it can happen to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I think it could honestly happen to anyone. And it's so interesting to see other significant people coming out of the woodwork, but also obviously many stories about people who are not thought leaders, who I've discovered are actually going on a similar journey to hers as well.
Well, and
so good.
Yeah, just we were talking a little off air. You know, most of the things we've talked about, other than this most recent one, but most of them we're talking about were UK examples, US examples. Are you seeing it in a broader perspective in the Western world?
Well, when it comes to this sort of, the core thesis of the book is that as New Atheism has waned and people have been looking for a story to make sense of their life, I think they're sort of opening up to the value of the Christian story again. And you're seeing that happen through all kinds of interesting influencers like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Jordan Peterson, and others who are kind of pointing people back to the Christian story. Is it just a UK-US thing? Interestingly, no, I think not. I think that I'm definitely seeing pockets of it happening all over the place. For instance, interestingly, France, a very secular country, reported in the Catholic Church last year its highest number of adult baptisms in the Catholic faith for years, probably, you know, since records began, really, because and that's very unusual. What's leading to that, you may ask? Finland. This could be a kind of a weird anomaly. It hasn't yet been reflected in other Nordic countries, but they recorded a doubling in the number of young men attending church in the last few years. Now these are just little signs that things are happening, but I'm also noticing just a change in the general tone of the conversation. People are not dismissing Christianity and God and faith in the way that they did during the era of the New Atheists. So for me, I think there are signs that it's happening in other places, but for me, it's more about actually a turning of the tide. It's not that I'm seeing masses of people suddenly coming to faith or, you know, sitting down in church on a Sunday, but I am seeing a real change in the nature of the conversation. And that's the thing that excites me, because it tells me that I think there's going to be a tide of people coming back. And we may just be seeing the first fruits of it in the stories of people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and some of these interesting statistics on the continent as well.
Justin, you mentioned, I wanted to ask you about Jordan Peterson, and you mentioned him just a minute ago, just in passing. By the way, I saw an interview, and I don't know who had it, but I saw it on Facebook with her and with an atheist who she had been friends with for years, and it was a fascinating fascinating interview. How does Jordan Peterson figure into this? We're almost out of time, unfortunately.
Well, Jordan Peterson, fascinating kind of psychologist who rose to fame in sort of 2017, 2018. And I had the good fortune of having him on my show to kind of have a debate about the God. And he's just one example of someone who has started to talk about God in the public square very differently to the New Atheists. And he's had a lot of run-ins with some of those New Atheist characters. And so because he's attracting such a large audience, the interesting thing is, where is he pointing to these young men and women looking for meaning and purpose and identity? He's pointing them back to the scriptures. He's giving like 2 or 3 hour lectures on the book of Genesis, for goodness sake. And so it's really interesting to see the way, as I say, the conversation has shifted. And I don't know where Jordan Peterson exactly is himself on the faith spectrum. When I asked him, so do you actually believe in God? He sort of answered, well, it depends what you mean by God. But what I do know is that he's pointing large numbers of his audience to Christianity. I know many people who have walked through the door to Christian faith because kind of Jordan Peterson made it intellectually acceptable to think about it. So I see him as another really interesting example of someone who's kind of realizes atheism has not done what people wanted it to do or thought it would do, and that we need to look at the Christian story again, and maybe we dismissed it too quickly.
Oh, Justin, this has been an absolutely great hour. We like you a lot, and we like your book, too. I hope we can do this again. The book is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. If you've been depressed with all the stuff that's negative, this book is going to help. Justin, thank you for taking time from a busy schedule to be with us. Hope we can do it again.
Thanks for having me on, guys. God bless.
Hey, guys, we're going to come back and tell you who we're going to do it unto next week. Don't go anywhere. Took a vote around here, and decided this was a great program. We absolutely loved it. You know, we get hit so often in so many places with anti-Christian propaganda. And it gets tiresome and boring. But you don't hear from the other side and what God is doing, and it's kind of refreshing to hear from somebody like Justin, who really is in touch and who's articulate to tell you stories that make you feel better about your faith. And by the way, what he said is very true. If you're not a believer, I have a real concern that your worldview is not going to help much when it gets really dark. It's not enough to sustain meaning in what you believe is a meaningless world. It's not enough to deal with a prognosis of a doctor who tells you you have cancer and a short time to live. And maybe more important than even those things, it's not enough to have this hole in your heart and nothing fits except God. Augustine said it, or prayed it, thou hast created us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. That absolutely is true. And I find it in so many places and talking to so many people. My late mentor, Fred Smith, said to a very angry unbeliever, Sam, you're not angry, you're hungry. And it just dawned on me, there is food for your hunger. Who's going to be on next week?
Next week, our friend Tom Rainer is going to be with us, and his book is titled, Where Have All the Church Members Gone? That's quite timely.
They're under the rug.
They're at home watching online or
and calling it church.
Calling it church.
So that'll be fun. That'll be a good program, and you don't want to miss it. Especially if you're a pastor. If you're a pastor, you might find out some things that are surprising about why they're leaving. And they may not be what you think. They're not thoughtful, wonderful people who thought about it and prayed about it for a long time. They just maybe got tired of the wishy-washy. Well, we'll see next week. Hope you join us. Same time, same place. We'll be here. Hope you will be too. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide berth.
Did you see how wide the berth got? About that big.
Yeah.
A wide berth. As opposed to...
Well, just maybe too much overconfidence. You didn't need a wide berth anymore.